am Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and today we are here at the World Economic History Congress in Kyoto, Japan. This is the first time that the World Economic History Congress has come to the Far East. It's quite an occasion for Chinese economic historians, and we've been interviewing a series of economic historians this week. And I might add that, that the World Economic History Congress is not the only one to begin making its way out to the Far East here. Less than a couple years ago, the Society for Economic Dynamics had its first conference in the Far East in Seoul, Korea. So many economic organizations are beginning to show an interest both in these regions as a topic, but also to recognize the scholarship that's been going on over here. And as a result of that, we're seeing a shift in many of these world and major Western organizations in economics and the social sciences. So today we're quite honored to have Professor Avner Greif here. He has a PhD from Northwestern University, where he worked with Joe Mulcair, the eminent economic historian there. He is a chaired professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University. And just as a general introduction, Professor Greif began his studies with medieval Europe, and he studied the Maghreb traders in Genoa, where Marco Polo was imprisoned, I might add. And he's gone on to institutions and comparative studies between the West and China. And so he is the one outlier of our group that we've invited for the interview. And the reason is that Professor Greif has shown a very active interest, it's a rare interest in beginning to compare China and the West. So let me first thank you for your time and coming for the interview.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
And we're happy to have you. So first, let me ask you a simple question. How did you become interested in economic history?
Well, I always liked economics, and I always liked history, in particular history. Economics you don't meet much in the high school. But when I went a little bit and walked and find out how important economics is for people, I thought that might be an interesting profession to learn. So basically, as an undergraduate at Tel Aviv University, I pursued a double major in economics and history, specifically the history of the Jewish people. And lo and behold, people would ask me, what do you do with economics and history? And I would say, you do history in the one hand and economics in the other hand. And that's it, because I never thought you can combine them together. But just before I graduated, Professor Elchanan Helfman, who is now at Harvard, at the time the chair of the economics department at Tel Aviv University, called me to his office and says, look, it seems like you are doing very well in those two areas of studies. There is something called economic history. Would you be interested in pursuing this in terms of graduate studies? At this point, I already thought that I would want to pursue career in academia. And what can be better than having the two hands meeting together in the middle?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you were told or you figured it out?
No, I already made my mind to be in academia. I was aspiring to have an academic career. That's the goal that I set to myself. Mm-hmm. So then putting the two areas of my passion together seems like a great way to go. Professor Elchanan Helfman was the one who ushered me through the process of application. I didn't trust the economists in the PhD program to teach me history, so therefore I pursued first a master in history, which included writing a thesis based on original sources, in order to make sure that I have my historical background ready.
And where was this? I'm sorry?
That was in Tel Aviv University as well. Okay. So this was under the directorships of the late Professor Moshe Gil, who introduced me to the study of the Maghreb traders. That's where I got my information. I wrote my thesis about the Jews of Sicily before the Crusaders period. So that was the topic of my dissertation. And then I applied to the various programs here and had the good luck of falling into the laps of Joel Mokyr and Charlie Calomiris, who at the time was an assistant professor at Northwestern. And for his course in American economic history, on monetary economic history in the US, I suggested to write a monetary history based on these 11th century traders, Mediterranean traders, Jewish traders who live in the Islamic world, basically in the western basin of the Mediterranean. To my surprise, he said, yes, sounds like a good idea. So then I started to return to work on the Maghrebi traders. And as time passed by, I realized that I'm more interested in industrial organization and governance structure issues. So I shifted the topic, which again, he was kind enough to allow me to do, to the issue of the organization of trade. And at this point, I got the Maghrebi right analysis up and running. It became clear to me that it'd be interesting to compare it to the European experience. And Genoa is the city-state in Italy, the forerunners of commerce, or emergence of commerce in Europe in the late medieval period. That Genoa has the earliest documents that will enable me to compare or to conduct equivalent research. So I look at 12th century Genoa and compare it to the 11th century Maghrebi traders of the Muslim world. And it was the comparison between the two that shaped my research furthermore and brought me to work on China, surprisingly enough.
I see. Well, on that, I'd like to begin asking you about some of your recent publications and working papers. First off is Risk, Institutions, and Growth, Why England and Not China, co-authored with Murat Yegun and Diego Sassan. Could you tell us a little bit about this research?
Yeah, so this research was part of the transition to working on China. What I've learned by comparing the Maghrebi traders and the Genoese was that the distinction between them lay in their cultural and social organization that led to different economic institutions that had different long-term implications despite short-term equivalence in terms of outcomes. So despite the fact that seemingly they were very similar in terms of what they did, what enabled them to do what they do was very different institutional foundations of the market. And those institutional foundations in themselves were not a product of the polity, of political processes, or political rulemaking, but rather the outcomes of distinct cultural foundations, or cultural inheritance. More individualistic cultures in Europe, more cooperative organizations based on interests in Europe, and more organization which is more based on innate social characteristics, Jews from particular region, particular area, and so on and so forth, among the Maghrebi traders. So that's led me to understand that perhaps one of the keys to to distinct economic outcomes in the long run is the social organization rather than the political organization, as political economy has always been about. And for good reasons. Again, I think political economy is important. But what about society? Society does not really exist in the realm of our analysis. Perhaps it's important. And furthermore, in this respect, the implication of it are broader than society versus politics, or the interaction between them. It's rather, the question is whether the issue of development depends on conflict or cooperation. What do I mean by that? That the basic idea in economics, following Adam Smith, long time ago, laissez-faire, let live. If just let people do what they want to do, pursuing your social self-interest will maximize social welfare. So what we need to study in order to understand development is the factors that hinders development from transpiring, because development is the default. You get Pareto optimal outcomes no matter what, if you just do what you want to do. And the focus of analysis, therefore, was on conflict, distributional conflict, that hindering from people to do what they want to do, and therefore you get better economic outcomes, less development. And in my view, the question was whether it is the focus that we should look at in studying development and long-term distinctions between economic processes development, is the issue of cooperation. How do people combine effort to achieve a common goal? Because after all, development is a social process. It's not an individual level process. Right? So this particular paper looks at particular aspect of this different view of the world. So the question is whether the social organization of poor relief mattered in the economic development of China and Europe.
I see.
And the organization of poor relief was very different.
Poor relief.
Poor relief, the help to the people who are destitute. Now, why this is a relevant issue in the context of development? Why poor? Why to put the poor there? Usually people put the elite as the factor that limit development. But this is the laissez-faire idea. If the elite wouldn't have been there to prevent the poor people from becoming rich, they would have become rich.
Right.
Well, but the process of development itself implies that many people who were content with their economic situation will become poor, just like many others will become rich. Development has distributional effect in and of itself. Why so? Because the essence of economic development, at least modern economic development, is that of machinery that save labor. That's the trick. That's what brought us here. But it does imply that in the short term, there'll be some people will lose their job, right? Because you are being replaced by machine. So in the initial process of development, when the labor market are thin, information is rare in between, people cannot move far away from where they live, and so on and so forth. If you leave your job, you may perish without social assistance. So people don't like to starve to death, and they don't like their family starving to death, even less. So therefore, they might resort, and likely to resort, to violence in terms of gaining foods. So stability, lack of change, is the best way to confront this problem. And as a matter of fact, if you look at England before 1970-50, the majority of the single largest group.
I'm sorry, before which time?
If you look at England.
Before 19...
Before, I'm sorry. If you look at England before 1800.
Before 1800.
Before 1800. And you look at the patterns that says what their implications on the market, on the economy will be. The single largest impact that they emphasize is that they are labor augmenting. They will increase demand for labor, not reduce it, which sounds counterintuitive to us. But in a world in which economic changes hinders people's livelihood and therefore might make them bandits, that's something you want to prevent. So the point that, so therefore poverty alleviation caused by economic development, by the transitions to labor saving, might have been important in facilitating the transition.
I see.
So lo and behold, this is a non-conventional way of viewing things. So that's led us to look at the distinctions between England and China in terms of the poor alleviation of poverty. And the distinctions are immense. And I can go into the detail if you're interested, but...
Briefly, please.
Yeah, so basically the main idea is that in China, the main poor relief system was based either on the clan trust or the family members or on the granary system.
And I'm sorry, could you please specify which period in China you're talking about,
That
roughly?
means that the trust clan started more or less in the Song dynasty.
Okay.
Right, that's when it started. And the basic perception was that by facilitating internal help within the clans, that will enable the government not to be involved in fostering transfer from individual to individuals when they resist it. Because the Chinese recognize very well that the humans have the natural tendency to take care of their siblings, of their kins, because that's the part of our genetic inheritance, right? So that was a system that Confucius has attributed to Confucius, and it works very well. Prior to the 9th century, or prior to the Song dynasty, as you know very well, there was the system of the equal field system. So people were more or less the same, but it's the Song dynasty in which there was not only large population movement, but commercialization, industrializations, and economic growth. That's led, and this end of the ability of the government to supply land to those who needs it, who do not have land. That's basically caused for the first time for poor to appear as a social category, social class in China. That's before it didn't exist. And the Chinese look how to solve this problem, that they would not become bandits. And the solution was to rely on the clan, on the extended family. And it's worked marvelously well. But over time, it became less and less effective. As number of people increase, the inequality in resources between clans, not between individuals, becomes bigger. And basically the system was declining over time. And with them decline innovations, as you know very well, decline over time as well. In England, the process of poverty alleviation was very different. Until the Reformations in the beginning of the 16th century, poor relief was provided by the church. It was uncertain, it was non-mandatory, it was based on the good heart of the people who run the monasteries and so on and so forth. But this was the system, for better or worse, it worked. But by the Reformation, all this system was gone. Henry VIII confiscated the property of the monasteries. He was supposed to put it into welfare and universities and other good deeds, but he preferred to fight for vain at French and other enemies, and basically the money was gone. The gentry became richer. As population began to grow again by the second half of the 16th century, there was a need to solve the problem. Under Elizabeth I, various arrangements were tried, and by the beginning of the 17th century, the old poor law, the Elizabethan poor law, was put in place. It basically made it illegal to die of starvations in England. Now, it's pretty hard to punish the guy who died from starvation for his misdeed, but the parish authorities were legally obliged to provide for the poor. And they had the right and the obligations to tax their own members, the wealthy members of the parish, to provide for the poor. This implies that those individuals who were trying to innovate, whether they were rich and poor, face a bottom and upper limit. They could apply for poor relief. Mm-hmm. But the incentives were different. The elite could invest because they didn't expect that the poor will come up and will destroy the machines that takes their livelihood. And the poor who try to innovate and to invent things because that human curiosity is existing everywhere were not prevented to do so by those who can provide them poor relief, because that was an individual choice. Same time, the poor relief enabled them to be able to live even if the invention itself failed to materialize. So it's created an environment which was conducive to economic innovations, in particular to labor-saving innovations. So again, it's not necessarily sufficient, but it's definitely part of the pictures that make it possible.
So if I understand things, the key distinction is, in essence, bandit prevention, and in England...
The maintenance of social order.
The maintenance of social order, okay.
In the period of transitions in which people lose their jobs.
And in England, they did a better job of this than they did in China, and this is what facilitated England's
better job will be somewhat of a too strong of a term. They were more effective in achieving it. But the granary system, which was the other part of the Chinese system, was very effective, and it was very, very big in terms of the number of the resources that were mobilized for the granary system. They were no lower, I would imagine, if not even bigger than the resources mobilized for the poor relief in England. The main distinction, however, is that the market in England, the relief for the poor was direct. Direct in England.
In England.
What do you mean by direct? Direct it was in the sense that the poor got the money or the food or the clothing or the coal, whatever he needed. But it was a transfer from the authorities to the individuals. In China, they worked through the granary system. But the granary system is helping the poor through the market mechanism. So the granary works by reducing the price when prices were high, which is wonderful, especially for those who are already in the market and buying it.
That's right.
Right? And as we know very well, the Chinese authorities were aware of the fact that the lower they push the market price, the more inclined the rich are to buy the cheap grains rather than to the poor. So that's a big distinction in terms of their effectiveness.
I see.
So it's not an administrative limitation, it's something else. It's the system they enacted.
So the middlemen took advantage of the system in the Chinese case.
It's not necessarily the middlemen, although there is a lot of evidence that this was the case, and the Chinese at the time were very concerned about corruption, because what does it mean to sell to the market? You have to sell to somebody. Who is this somebody who buys it lower price and sell it for profit? It can be your cousin or your friend.
I see.
But the point was that it was not a direct transfer to the poor. It was intermediated through the market. So inherently, even without corruption or anything else, it would have been less effective in terms of helping the poor, because you help everybody, not only the poor.
I see. I can certainly see this becoming a problem beginning at least in the Song dynasty, in that it was during the Northern Wei dynasty in the latter part of the 6th century that they began this equal field system, where essentially people were granted a plot of land in return for taxes and military service. But this system broke down in the Song dynasty for the first time, and there was an open market for land. Land was freely traded, and so you could see poor and rich emerging and inequalities, and these clans, it seems quite sensible that these clans would begin to appear to take care of their own, as some people were left out of these exchanges in the land market system. Let me ask you one question, which I apologize, I meant to ask you first. Your major book, which has been quite well received, Institutions and the Path to Modern Economy, Lessons from Medieval Trade, published by Cambridge University Press. How does that fit into this picture of your
So that's fit in terms of the basic approach to the issue of institutions, cultures, and economic outcomes. That's how it relates, on the first relationship. The second, in terms of the subject matter. So let me first with the first one. The point is that economic theory and so the way that I have studied there is, or the way that the book is written. The book advocates an approach to study economic history, economic processes over time, which I call historical and comparative institutional analysis. It emerged in the context, it's basically what brought me to Stanford, in which Masaoki, Paul Milgrom, and other scholars were thinking in the same vein or in the same directions, and that's part of the reason I ended up to be there and being in their company and benefiting from their wisdom. So, but the point, the idea is to look not at one factor at a time, and not, so the basic idea is to understand that that what we need to study is historical processes, but history is too descriptive in order to make sense out of it, one damn thing after another, and therefore you need an analytical framework that will constrain.
Sure.
The analytical framework that I've used in the book is particularly game theory, and the beauty about it is that it also leaves many topics or many issues or possible outcomes. The multiplicity of equilibrium in even a very simple game theoretical framework. But at the same time, the advantage of the game theoretical framework is that it enables you to capture the impact of culture in a way that other frameworks have our time to capture. Why so? Because game theoretical enable you to map from one observable to another through beliefs by the individuals involved in the interaction about events that do not transpire on the equilibrium path. Belief whether I'll be punished by the court if I do something bad, or I'll punish by other commerciants. That can be captured, and you can generate predictions with respect to various outcomes, observable outcomes, based on the assumption that one or another of those beliefs prevail. So it enables you to access the issue of culture and its influence on behavior and outcomes in a way which is not possible in many others. But again, the same problem transpires here as well. The analytical framework restricts the set of outcomes which are feasible to those that are self-enforcing specifically and credible, but at the same time it leaves many options open. So it was the combination of the history and the theory, that both of them constrain the others, that gives me the analytical leverage. But furthermore, then you go back in history. So you get a lot of predictions that you can match. And then you go comparatively. So then you have different predictions to match. So it is the scope of the analysis and the combination of the history and the analytical framework which gave me the ability to discuss institutions and their relationship to culture in a way that was not done before. But in terms of substance, again, what became clear to me is that the Maghrebi traders, members of the Muslim society of the time, 11th century, Egypt in particular, or the Muslim West, were organized very differently than those in the West. The West was organized around corporations, namely mutual, consensual, social organizations based on interest, while the Maghrebis were organized based on innate features. And that's led me to think about the generality of this phenomena. And China was a natural place to talk about social relationship based on innate the clan system versus the European cooperative basis of social organization based on cooperation.
I see. So for this game theory application into economic history, it seems to me the most difficult part, from what I would gather, would be trying to take your beliefs in your theoretical model and somehow match them to your historical cases. I mean, that's where the kind of the tire hits the road. In terms of the theoretical application, you could
generate a lot of outcomes.
Generate your outcome that you want, but it's going to be based on your beliefs. So, how successful, or what are the pros and cons of matching the beliefs to the particular historical applications that you're looking at?
Yeah, so there is always the difficulty. So I would not underestimate the difficulty of doing this research well. So it's any analytical and empirical framework, it has its deficiencies. And in particular, the way to do it is more a craft, an art than a craft. In the sense that you have to know a lot in order to be able to identify these predictions. For example, one of the predictions that I had in terms of the comparison is whether merchants will be organized horizontally versus vertically. Do I hire somebody who is also a merchant as my agent in overseas trade, or do I hire somebody who is not, who is only an agent? That's a prediction that, unless you are aware of the fact that those were organizational or contractual features that were feasible in both societies, which is an empirical question or historical question, then you would not necessarily pay attention to it. Note that the predictions, although quantitative, it's whether more or less, is not necessarily something you can put in the regression. Right? So it's a prediction which is qualitative by nature, despite the fact that there is numbers oriented there. So that's big part of the challenge. The challenge is you have to understand very well the historical context and the comparison. So you will be able to identify the set of predictions that enable you to conduct the research. But the most important one is the distinction, the conceptual distinctions between the games that we analyze and the institution we want to study and the cultural beliefs we want to study.
Yes.
And the distinction is that game is the mean to an end. It's not that they are involving in the game. That's the mechanism through which we constrain what might be the outcomes if they perceive the game to be one way or another. Right. So the point is that when you look at the games from this perspective, the cultural beliefs, the difference between strategies, what I do in the game, and the culture is what I take with me to the new situation. In game theoretical analysis, as you probably very well aware of, if I change the rule of the games, there is another action possible for me. The game starts afresh. There is no relationship between the equilibrium conception, the equilibrium that prevailed at time t before the change and at time t plus 1 with the change. Realistically, however, we know that people are people. I mean, between period t and t plus 1, it will be the same individual sitting there on the node. And this implies that, so the cultural element is manifests itself in the people bringing with them to a new situation the beliefs they held before. And those beliefs are the initial conditions in their taking action. But those beliefs will influence their decisions whether to create a new action, so a new situation, whether to create a new organization or not. Because in creating something new, you have to anticipate what the response to it will be. And the best predictor you have is based on what had transpired in the past. So whatever is not changed, the cultural beliefs will tell you what will happen as the initial conditions. It's only with respect to what will be new, that's where the uncertainty is. But so that's the way that basically this game theoretical analysis of strategies and what people will do in a particular contingencies becomes part of their cultural beliefs that they bring to new situations and motivate them to change the rules of the game in various ways. And but this is not let's create the predictions and the time dimension so that the connections between the past and the present, the past and the future.
I see.
It was a little bit tough to explain, I must admit. But,
No, I understand. I think our audience in the economics community understand. I didn't mean that question to be
so long, yeah.
No, I didn't mean the question to be discouraging in the sense that I'm actually in precisely the same game. I do dynamic game theory, and at the end of the day, I can write down a model that says under institution A you get equilibrium A, and under institution B you can get equilibrium B. But you can pick up the Review of Economic Dynamics and find thousands of papers like this. Mm. The difficulty is when you get involved in economic history is showing that the institution A is relevant to the particular period or country you're looking at, and institution B is.
I agree with you.
And this is all usually largely qualitative and requires a lot of cost in terms of
so basically the basic line in terms of what you were asking is that the basic framework within which I use this book, and that's the contribution that goes, I hope, beyond the particularities of what I've studied, is the framework within which you can study the impact or rigorously study the impact of cultures and institutions and the interrelationship in a unified framework which is based on the predictive power of the theory on the one hand and the constraints imposed to you by the historical facts and observations.
And the matching of
these. And the matching of these, but not only over time, but also in terms of the comparison.
Yes.
So the idea is we think about economics as fitting a line in econometrica. Mm-hmm. Right? So we both know that if you have 1 point, you have infinite number of lines. If you have 2 points, you have only one line that can move between
sure.
the two of them, if the line is straight. But the line may not be straight, and again, you have infinite amount of lines. So the more dots you have, the smaller.
That's right.
The smaller is the number of lines you can fit in. So my approach with the comparative and historical is to fit the line to dots in terms of the time dimension and the comparative dimension. And that's the way I gain more confidence in the argument and the assertions, the conjecture that I'm trying to evaluate.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to this approach. This is essentially similar research that I'm doing, and is matching these model assumptions and key features to the historical cases. It takes quite a bit of time and effort, as you say. You really have to match the history and the economics, and it's not a part-time job.
That's true. It's not a part-time. A good way to put it. Yeah.
So with that, let me go on to your next paper that you've been working on. It was published in the American Economic Review in 2010. It was co-authored with Guido Tabellini, Cultural and Institutional Bifurcation, China and Europe Compared. Could you tell us a little bit about this paper? Yeah,
so this paper basically was the summary of our conjecture with respect to the bifurcation, cultural and institutional bifurcation in China and Europe. The basic idea was that in the beginning of the first millennium, the Song dynasty in China, more or less, late Tang dynasty in China, and what the so-called late medieval period, the 10th, 11th century until the 14th century in Europe, there was changes in the social and the cultural environment in both locations in such a way that influenced institutional development in the long run. And in some respect, this paper comes not only from my research, but also as a response to Kenneth Pomeranz's marvelous book about the Great Divergence, which is a masterpiece by all means in terms of showing or making the argument that the standard of living between China and Europe did not differ much until very recent in historical time. There's been quite a lot of debate later on if he's right or wrong, but that's not the point. The point that drew my attention was the mere fact that we are comparing outcomes, not the processes through which these outcomes have been achieved. And once you compare outcomes, you can have you can say the two are identical. But if the processes are not the same that brought them to this locality, then the trajectory to the future might be very different. Mm. So saying there was no difference and therefore in outcome and therefore they were identical is ignoring this possibility. So taking what I've known about the distinction, the importance of the innate social organizations, the Maghrebis, and the non-innate one, or interest-based cooperations among the European, it was kind of naturally for me to move into this arena. So what we make in this paper, we make the tentative claim that there has been change in the social organizations in Europe and in China around this period of time. In China, the social organizations became more oriented toward clans, towards social organization based on kinship relationship or kin-like relationship, particularistic relationship. While in Europe, this has not been the case, but the opposite was the case. There was the end, this was a period in which there was the end of the dissolutions of the kinship structures in most of Europe, due to the influence of Christianity. And the transitions to organize the society is based on cooperations. Cooperation in the medieval sense, not business cooperation as we have now, but organizations of people that comes together regardless of kinship based on their interests. They are voluntary, they are self-governed, they are coming to benefit their members. They are horizontal in structure in the sense that every member is the same. They elect the person who leads them, but he is agent of the members of the corporation rather than any other source of power. And the question that we raise there is whether this had implications in the long run, and we build on the previous paper on poverty, as the poverty alleviation, as I mentioned before, but we raised other possibilities in terms of why did it come about and so on and so forth.
I see. So finally, on this particular topic, you have one other paper also with Guido Tavolini, which I believe is yet to be published, The Clan and the City, Sustaining Cooperation in China and Europe.
Yeah, so this is the broader paper in which we try to really flesh out the research agenda, or the conjectures that we had, and to evaluate it. And part of the reason that it's not published 5 years out or thereabout is two reasons. First of all, is it's a little bit too big for its own self. Namely, it's definitely calling for a book menace rather than a paper. And we do talk with Princeton University Press about publishing it. They're very interested, and so on and so forth. Basically, there wouldn't be a problem of publishing it, that's for sure. But furthermore, I was not pleased enough with the level of my historical knowledge, in a sense, both conceptually in terms of what exactly we do there analytically, as well as the data that I have. And what changed since then, and I'll get into the detail of what it does, was the collaborations with Professor Yan from the SUFI, Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, whom I met at Stanford when he visited there. And he was kind enough to help us out by collecting large data sets about, or encoding large data, a large amount of data about Chinese clans. And that's, for me, was the linchpin for our analytical framework, or to our historical claims and approach. It enabled us to evaluate for the first time, and now the data set is composed of 50,000 observations about clans over time. So place of origin, time of origin, moving, migrating from one province to another, and so on and so forth, rewriting the clan. So that's enabled us to really substantiate when did clan arose, indeed the late Tang and the Song dynasty. When did they migrate, which would be the Ming and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing. And when did they settle down, which would be the Qing, the late Ming, the Qing, and the republics. They're able to establish or to identify the movement of the clans, or the clan genealogy, rewriting to Taiwan after the revolution, and its resurgence after 79, after the reforms. There is a big peak there, and so on and so forth. So basically, it enabled us, but furthermore, it's also enabled us to create a measure of the proportion of the clans in each time period and province that held property. So the question that's resolved for me, at least the question where there were simply, not simply, but only social phenomena, or were there also economic phenomena? And they were economic phenomena by an order of magnitude. about 25 to 26 on average, about 25 or 26 of the clans had common property throughout space and time in China. Of course, the number of clans changes in various provinces and so on and so forth, but whenever there was a clan, that was the probability that it will hold common property for their members. But what we also did, we expanded the analysis to generate more points of comparison in terms of the political organization, in terms of the role of the gentry versus the role of the gentry in Europe. The names are the same, but the content is very different. In terms of the social organization of production, in terms of innovations, and so on and so forth. So that's what we were working to do it. So basically, this paper comes to substantiate the conjecture that the clan and the corporation, as main unit of social organizations, emerged more or less at the beginning of the last millennium, that in both places they became more powerful and more dominant over time. And this has substantial implication on institutional foundations in these various economic activities in these two societies and on the outcomes in the long run. That's what this paper does. And in some sense, this book,
like,
yeah, in some sense, this is the first analysis that I'm familiar of, but perhaps I missed something and I'd be happy to hear about it, of a comparative analysis of the two societies over the long run that does not assume that everything comes either from the polity or from endowment or from other variables beyond control like fertility or demographic.
Yes.
Which is, again, it's not that we are saying that those factors are not important. Of course they are. But the question is whether social organization matters as well, and that's what we try to substantiate. And I think we are doing it quite successfully.
Well, it sounds very interesting. I look forward to seeing your book, and even
Thank you.
people who work on political institutions in some sense will be forced to take a look at this, because political institutions are mental concepts which social groups must accept, and there's a link there. And so
Absolutely.
the social organization underneath the political institutions definitely have a feedback role, and so you're only looking at part of the picture if you're looking at political institutions. So in that sense, you're definitely going to be successful in adding the contribution.
Yeah, you cannot put it, I couldn't put it better than the way that you say it. I mean, in my view, the idea that you can look at politics independent of society is missing a big part of the project, of the point. And there are complementary projects that looks at those aspects. So for example, one of them is political legitimacy. Another one of them is why do totalitarian societies, political systems, that basically can give you hard time if you are not following what they want you to follow. And
Exactly.
Why do they fail to change your underlying beliefs and morals in the way that they want to do, as economic models of these processes claim should have happened? Right?
Yes.
And over it doesn't happen. Culture has persistence, that society has persistence, that overcomes a lot of hurdles and over time. But at the same time, it changes, and even within a society, it's not uniform. That's complexity and commonalities we want to understand.
Well, very good. That covers the topics that I wanted to go over, which is why we invited you, because you've been working comparatively with China in the West. But I also wanted to ask you about more recent research, and in particular, what is the general insights to the economic profession of this research?
So the first and foremost, there are several of them. That's mean, first and foremost, there is the distinction between focusing on conflict versus focusing on cooperation. In some sense, conflict are easier to study. War, civil wars, you see. Cooperation, you don't see. Right? It just simply happens, but there are no waves around. There are no echoes that transpire. But at the same time, for my view at least, the essence of development and long-term growth is cooperation within the country, between group, external with other forces, and so on and so forth. And economists have the laissez-faire inheritance that basically says, if people will be left by their own, they will do good. We wouldn't have sit in this building if people would have left by their own. This building was not built by the people per se, by a person. It was built by an organizations, that corporations of many units, and so on and so forth. So that's the first one. So conflict versus cooperation. The second one is politics.
By the way, I have to interject one notable contribution, fundamental contribution of a former colleague, Leo Hurwicz, who came up with the theoretical foundations for this, for which he won the Nobel Prize, is the oldest Nobel Prize winner at 90. And Minnesota graduates were quite proud and happy that he did get it. But those were purely theoretical contributions, but they laid the groundwork for later such analysis. But
perhaps it's not coincident that Masaoki, my colleague at Stanford, was a student of Horowitz, which just indicate, that's
the theory. The theory seems to have come first, but now it's our generation, our job to now start matching it to data and so forth.
Yeah. The second important issue is whether constraints on development comes from the bottom or from above. Namely, we are talking about the Malthusian check, we are talking about political rent-seeking, and so on and so forth, as the main constraint on development. But the mere fact that a person wants to live is not to survive, to have food on the table, is not exactly something we should condemn, right? And I think we are interprojecting our living in a society in which food on the table is not the issue. Societies in which the daily struggle was, what will I eat next, right? Where will the wheat come from? Where will the meat come from, if at all? And in terms of stability and closeness to the land was the general way in which this problem of poverty, access to food, was solved in the pre-modern societies. And it's breaking this link, which requires social cooperation, that was crucial, in my opinion at least, or in my view, in the ability to move out. So let's compare, just to give you an example, note that I was talking about England, not about the United Kingdom and not about Great Britain, right? Because
may I interject and ask you why?
Because Scotland has a different poor relief system than England.
I see.
As a matter of fact, the kirks, the church organizations in Scotland, object to any redistribution through taxation. They say it's a matter of moral of the individual to decide whether he wants to give or not.
I see.
So in this respect, for example, while the Enlightenment, as my mentor, Joel Mokyr, has been recently emphasizing and quite convincingly, while the Enlightenment was very important in moving the elite to do things, to advance science and technology and so on and so forth, and he's definitely right that this has been the case, despite the fact that the Scottish Enlightenment came before and was definitely deeper than the English Enlightenment, whether there was Enlightenment in English or not is a historical debate that he had to win first. But the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, his manifestation of this project, is undoubtedly there. But no, they didn't have industrial revolution. They didn't have the economic takeoff that England had until the English became, so Scotland became part of England, and the poor relief system changed.
I see.
Right. So that's
so the Industrial Revolution, in your view, was really began in England,
and not in Scotland.
Despite the fact. And how about Wales?
Wales is somewhat Wales is falling within England.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is no distinction per se.
Okay.
This to the 17th century. Yeah. But Ireland is again different because they have the Catholic Church. So. And I looked at the patent records in this period of time, before and during the Industrial Revolutions. You do have patents from Irish, you do have patents from Scottish, and so on and so forth. They come to England, they do it there, but presumably they couldn't implement it in Scotland. They implemented it in England itself.
I see.
So that's will be my
general
perception. Yeah.
Insight for the economists. Well, very good. I think at this time we'd like to thank Professor Greif for his time. I had the pleasure of meeting him at Stanford University about a year ago. He was kind enough to invite me over, and I'm happy to invite him here for this interview for economists in the West who don't know about his recent work. and I hope it was done at a level for economists to understand briefly and quickly the basic thrust of his recent research, and we thank him. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we hope you enjoy your stay here in Kyoto at the first time the World Economic History Congress has made it out here to the Far East.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So first, let me ask you a simple question. How did you become interested in economic history?
Well, I always liked economics and I always liked history, in particular history. Economics you don't meet much in the high school. But when I went a little bit and walked and find out how important economics is for people, I thought that might be an interesting profession to learn. So basically, as an undergraduate at Tel Aviv University, I pursued a double major in economics and history, specifically the history of the Jewish people. And lo and behold, people would ask me, what do you do with an economics and history? And I would say, you do history in the one hand and economics in the other hand. And that's it, because I never thought you can combine them together. But just before I graduated, Professor Elchanan Helfman, who is now at Harvard, at the time the chair of the economics department at Tel Aviv University, called me to his office and says, look, it seems like you are doing very well in those two areas of studies. There is something called economic history.
The chaired professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University. And just as a general introduction, Professor Greif began his studies with medieval Europe, and he studied the Maghreb traders in Genoa, where Marco Polo was imprisoned, I might add. And he's gone on to institutions and comparative studies between the West and China. And so he is the one outlier of our group that we've invited for the interview. And the reason is that Professor Greif has shown a very active interest, it's a rare interest in beginning to compare China and the West. So let me first thank you for your time and coming for the interview.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
And we're happy to have you. Hello, I am Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and today we are here at the World Economic History Congress in Kyoto, Japan. This is the first time that the World Economic History Congress has come to the Far East. It's quite an occasion for Chinese economic historians, and we've been interviewing a series of economic historians this week. And I might add that,
Why would you be interested in pursuing this in terms of graduate studies? At this point, I already thought that I would want to pursue career in academia. And what can be better than having the two hands meeting together in the middle?
I'm sorry, you were told or you figured it out?
No, I already made my mind to be in academia. I was aspiring to have an academic career. That's the goal that I set to myself.
Mm-hmm.
So then putting the two areas of my passion together seems like a great way to go. Professor Elchanan Helfman was the one who ushered me through the process of application. I didn't trust the economists in the PhD program to teach me history, so therefore I pursued first a master in history, which included writing a thesis based on original sources, in order to make sure that I have my historical background ready.
And where was this? I'm sorry?
That was in Tel Aviv University as well.
Okay.
So this was under the directorships of Professor
The World Economic History Congress is not the only one to begin making its way out to the Far East here. Less than a couple years ago, the Society for Economic Dynamics had its first conference in the Far East in Seoul, Korea. So many economic organizations are beginning to show an interest both in these regions as a topic, but also to recognize the scholarship that's been going on over here. And as a result of that, we're seeing a shift in many of these world and major Western organizations in economics and the social sciences. So today we're quite honored to have Professor Avner Greif here. He has a PhD from Northwestern University, where he worked with Joe Mulcair, the eminent economic historian there. He is